Well, welcome folks on this rainy Saturday morning during finals week at Villanova University. I'm very happy you could make it, that you could tear yourself away from studying for a day. The conference goes a day, or from writing whatever paper you're working on now. Right, Leanne?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Today we're talking about the political thought of James Madison. And this is part of the Ryan Center of Villanova University's continuing lecture series on the American founding. I want to thank particularly the Apgar Foundation for their support of this. We are very fortunate today to have two distinguished, and in fact, two of the leading scholars on James Madison, not only in the country, but in the world today. Richard K. Matthews and Alan Gibson. Richard Matthews is National Endowment for the Humanities Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Political Science Department at Lehigh University. His research interest is in political philosophy with a specialization in ideologies in early American political thought. In 2007, he received the Pan-Hellenic Outstanding Faculty Award. Professor Matthews served on the editorial board of the Northeastern Political Science Association's journal, Polity, from 1990 to 1996. Of his many publications, the one that we're particularly interested in today is If Men Were Angels, James Madison and the Heartless Empire of Reason. And this was published in 1995 by the University Press of Kansas. He's also written The Philosophic Roots of Modern Ideology, Liberalism, Communism, Fascism, Islamism. He has co-authored with Ingersoll and Davison, this in its third edition from Prentice Hall. He's also written The Radical Politics of Thomas Jefferson, a revisionist view. And Dr. Matthews has a very interesting interpretation not only of Jefferson and Madison, but of their relationship and particularly of their conflicting political ideas. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto. I'm also going to introduce Dr. Gibson right now so that when we proceed forward, we'll go for about an hour. Rick with 40 minutes and some Q&A, a quick break, and then Dr. Gibson will speak. And for those of you who will be here for the day, that'll be followed by lunch and then a roundtable discussion this afternoon in the Fettigan Room. Dr. Gibson is Professor of Political Science at California State University, Chico, thus the tan. In 2007, he was awarded a year-long National Endowment for the Humanities grant to continue his research on the political thought of James Madison and the foundations of American democratic thought. He was a visiting research fellow in the summer of 2006 at the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation's Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies awarded him a fellowship in 2005 for research on James Madison's theory of an extended republic, out of which quite a lot of publication and work has come. Professor Gibson's publications include Understanding the Founding, The Crucial Questions, as well as a companion piece, Interpreting the Founding, Guide to the Enduring Debates over the Origins and Foundations of the American Republic. And of course, all of these books are available on Amazon.com. Professor Gibson also has a plethora of articles that he's written on James Madison that constitute probably more than a book. I'll just name a few of them right now. Ancients and Moderns, the Republican Liberalism Debate. He's also written Impartial Representation and the Extended Republic. Also, Veneration and Vigilance and the Review of Politics. Professor Gibson received his PhD from that place with the golden dome, otherwise known as Notre Dame University. And we are very fortunate to have these two wonderful, thoughtful, and provocative scholars with us today. Join me in welcoming Rick Matthews and Alan Gibson.
Well, that's why they were there.
We may want to get rid of that.
Thank you for this invitation. I particularly like being invited to relatively small colleges and universities since they played such a significant part in my life. I did my undergraduate work at Muhlenberg College, which is a much smaller than either Lehigh or Villanova. And it had a transformative effect on me as a whole new universe of books and ideas were open to me. A few years ago, I was invited to be the commencement speaker at a local high school, one which I graduated from. After the event, a former teacher of mine came up to me and said she was amazed to learn that I had read 6 books, let alone had written 6 books. This morning, I'd like to present an overview of Madison's political philosophy by establishing some images, notions, guideposts to help to situate his thought. Given this audience, I do not want to rehash the familiar Madison of Federalist 10, where he gives his brilliant analysis of factions and begins to spell out how to deal with them through representation, an extended republic, federalism, checks and balances, a written constitution, and other auxiliary devices. I want to talk a bit about Madison off the beaten path. To some degree, I will talk about the public Madison, the one who helped write the Federalist Papers and the author of the lesser-known National Gazette essays. Although I should pause to say that I think the lack of attention about these essays will soon be fading, thanks to the wonderful new book about them by Professor Sheehan. But I will talk about the private Madison and the public Madison. To talk about Madison as a political philosopher is itself somewhat problematic. Remember, there's no second treatise on government, there's no social contract, there's no a theory of justice, just thousands of documents. If you look at the papers of Madison, and there's various collections of those, not all of them are called the papers of James Madison, they're about 30 volumes, and they're about 500 pages each, containing pamphlets, essays, speeches, state papers, notes, and letters. What I try to do is to read all of them, that part I can do actually, and then try to find the order that I do think is in them, so to make order out of what appears to be chaos. I think Madison is a systematic thinker who is remarkably consistent in his views. This is incredible when you remember he held political office for 4 decades. So I consider him a philosopher, although his philosophy comes in a rather unconventional form. By looking at Madison's writings, not giving too much weight to the Federalist Papers, or prioritizing his contributions to the drafting and ratifying of the Constitution, I think a clearer picture of Madison's own philosophy is possible. In other words, if Madison had not been involved in nation building, or there had not been a second constitution established in 1787, what would his political theory look like? Now, before I do that, I want to say something about the subtitle of my talk. The talk is titled Madison's Political Philosophy, Malthus, Angels and/or Philosophers and Machines. If you think about each of these words in the context of James Madison's political thought, they can help provide a focus or focal points to understanding his views. Take angels. Madison is well known for his statement in Federalist 51, Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Madison believed there was little that could be thought of as angelic about humans, so some form of government would be necessary. And since angels were not going to be doing the governing, some checks on the government would be necessary as well. I should mention in passing that Jefferson had a rather different view of this than Madison, since Jefferson thought anarchism was indeed a possible and positive form of social organization. But Madison's point is, don't count on angels when it comes to government. Like angels, Madison also had some consistent ideas on philosophers. In Federalist 49, he wrote, "The reason of man, like man himself, is timid and cautious when left alone, and requires firmness and confidence in proportion to the number with which it is associated. When the examples which fortify it are ancient as well as numerous, they are known to have a double effect. In a nation of philosophers, this consideration ought to be disregarded. A reference for the laws would be sufficiently inculcated by the voice of enlightened reason. But a nation of philosophers is as little to be expected as the philosophical race of kings wished for by Plato." It seems clear that Madison is using the term philosophers in a similar manner to angels. Do not count on angels or philosophers. Individuals are cautious, timid, and reasonable when acting alone, but humans always end up acting in groups, what he calls factions, what we call interest groups. And these groups will compete, quarrel, and even fight other groups over, in his words, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions. Arguably, Madison's least charitable image of human nature involves a philosopher. He writes, "Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob." Here Madison takes the West symbol of the wise and just human and says that even a room of Socrates would need a Leviathan to maintain order. But there's more to Madison when it comes to philosophers. Whether discussing theories or ideas, Madison always drew a sharp distinction between theory and practice. For example, he thought free markets and laissez-faire policies made perfect sense in theory, but that trying to put those ideas into actual practice would have meant ruin for the new nation, since so many of her businesses needed to be protected. Philosophers were to be read and discussed, but never should their ideas be put into direct practice. In fact, his own philosophy was a pragmatic amalgam of many of Western philosophy's leading lights. The third word, machines. I'm borrowing that from a popular book by Michael Kamen's on the United States Constitution titled "A Machine That Would Go of Itself." Madison thought of the American political system when it was functioning smoothly as a kind of self-regulating machine that through its ingenious design could virtually run itself. That is not to say that humans had no role to play in politics, but that he conceptualized his system as machine-like. In a private letter to the Marquis de Lafayette, written in 1809, Madison describes the American government thus: "A government like ours has so many safety valves, giving vent to overheated passions, that it carries within itself a relief against the infirmities from which the best of human institutions cannot be exempt." So there you have three images, angels, philosophers, and machines, to keep in mind as I proceed. But what about Malthus? Retirement from public office in 1816 left Madison with abundant time to attend to his farm, recall the events that led to the creation of the American state, and contemplate the future of his country. Finding himself free, not only from the pressing concerns of ratifying the Constitution or reigning in the power of the Federalist-controlled executive branch, apprehensions which clearly lurk in the background of Madison's contributions to the Federalist and the National Gazette essays, but also free from what he called the labors and anxieties of public life. Madison's 1818 address to the Agricultural Society offers scholars a non-politically motivated essay. It shows, in a rudimentary form, his calm and mature views on certain critical dimensions to human nature, and several candid insights into his general philosophic orientation towards life. In this address can be located 5 initial characteristics of Madison's concept of humanity. To begin, humans are both rational and lazy. If free to choose between the two, they would prefer a life of ease without civilization. Although the disposition to indolence and degeneracy constitutes the bent of human nature, 2, the inevitability of surplus population and the finiteness of nature's bounty requires humans to plan for the future in order to provide for themselves as rationally as possible. If they fail to do so, 3, the automatic checks and balances of nature, her beautiful economy, will reinstitute the order and sense of proportion in her system in spite of nature's order. 4, humanity's tendency to degeneration, whether in terms of economic evolution or urban decay, never disappears and always threatens our best efforts. Consequently, tension and conflict characterize the ambivalent essence of Madison's worldview. Order versus disorder, rationality versus laziness, civilization versus degeneration, the Enlightenment's promise versus Malthus's curse. After Madison thanks his audience for the honor of being selected to be the presiding officer and informing them that his topic would be improving the agriculture of our country, Madison began by noting that the faculty of cultivating the earth and of rearing animals, by which food is increased beyond the spontaneous supplies of nature, belongs to man alone. Planning for the future, beyond immediate physical need, is a capacity which humans alone possess. At moments, Madison's address sounds as if he is responding directly to the concerns raised by Thomas Malthus in his influential 1798 An Essay on the Principles of Population, where Malthus presented his theory of the inevitability of overpopulation and the equally inevitable checks upon this condition provided by war, famine, and disease. Interestingly, Dolly Madison proudly claimed that her husband had drawn Malthus's conclusions a full decade before Malthus, and there is a lot of evidence to confirm her claim. Now, after establishing the importance of an abundant food supply for the progress of humanity, Madison argued that the very process of moving to the stage of economic evolution, where agricultural development could begin, required nearly heroic acts of will and reason, since it was, from his perspective, counter-instinctive. Throughout his address, Madison demonstrated his indebtedness to ideas from the Scottish Enlightenment's Adam Smith. Madison echoes the logic of Smith's 4 stages of human progress, from hunting to pastoral to agricultural to commercial societies. The last of these stages was described interchangeably as commercial society or civil society, and of course, it corresponded to America's present condition of being a commercial republic. Even though agriculture promised the greatest probability for a stable and abundant food supply, as well as affording the opportunity to support an expanding population, human nature, Madison insisted, prefers always the less civilized social conditions. He notes, there is a disinclination in human nature to exchange the savage for the civilized life cannot be questioned. Madison believed that Virginia and her immediate past experience with her Indian neighbors supplied ample proof of this generalization. He writes, the Indian tribes have ever shown an aversion to the change. Neither the persuasive examples of plenty and comfort derived from the culture of the earth by their white brethren, nor the lessons and specimens of tillage placed in the midst of them, and seconded by actual sufferings from a deficient and precarious subsistence, have converted them from their strong propensities and habitual pursuits. In the same spirit, they always betray an anxious disposition to return to their pristine life after weaned from it by time, and apparently molded by intellectual and moral instruction into the habits and tastes of an agricultural people. Madison, not wanting to establish universal human principles on the basis of observations derived from a single society, also acknowledged that, again this is Madison, a still more conclusive evidence of the bias of human nature is seen in the familiar fact that our own people, nursed and reared in these habits and tastes, easily slide into that of the savage, and are rarely reclaimed to civilized society with their own consent. Madison drove home his implied point about the slothful nature of humanity, one of the 7 deadly sins, when he hypothesized on the probable development of America if the original Pilgrims had not been forced by fear of death and an ongoing contact with Europe to duplicate their past. He writes, "They might have spread themselves into the forest where game and fruits would have abounded," he speculated, "and, gradually forgetting the arts, no longer necessary to their immediate wants, have degenerated into savage tribes." So humans are both lazy and often unreasonable. Fortunately, reality has been constructed in such a manner that humans must labor if they are to survive. Nevertheless, if humans use their reason and exercise their will, they can extend the bounds of nature and thereby sustain and increase the population up to a point. To the liberal Madison, the lessons of human nature were clear. Although given the faculty of reason, if offered the choice, humans prefer the short-term path of least resistance to their goals of immediate and easy gratification. If fear of the savage tribes or of an inadequate food supply had not forced the American settlers to employ agriculture, their natural inclinations would have led them back to a primitive existence where the knowledge of progress would eventually have disappeared into oblivion. While this tendency remains part of the human condition, Madison also viewed it as unreasonable. It's significant to notice that when Madison thinks about the Indians in isolation from Europeans, he writes of their living in tribes. And yet when he thinks about them in comparative terms of Europe and the threat they present to civilization, he worries about European degeneration, and the tribes at this point are described by him as savage. Anyway, to Madison, agriculture, its use and abuse, comprises a useful yardstick to measure human progress and rationality. Although his fundamental point on human nature had been established, it was so central to his worldview that he took even more time to elaborate. The bent of human nature prefers the less developed stages of human development. He writes, "The manufacturer readily exchanges the loom for the plow in opposition often to his own interest, as well as that of his country. The cultivator, in situations presenting an option, to the labors of the field, the more easy employment of rearing the herd. And as the game of the forest is approached, the hunting life displays the force of its attractions." So universal was this tendency to retreat that Madison rhetorically asked if the opposite flow had ever been witnessed. Where do we behold a march to the opposite direction? The hunter becoming the herdsman, the latter a follower of the plow, and the last repairing to the machinery or workshop. The manufactory or workshop. Given Madison's view of human nature and social development, why we ever created civilization becomes a question he cannot easily resolve. Unable to explain rationally why humans left the excitement, independence, chaos, and joys of the garden, Madison leapt to conjecture that the first introduction of agriculture among a savage people appears accordingly never to have taken place without some extraordinary interposition. So important for the progress of humanity was the revolution produced by the introduction of agriculture, Madison claimed that it must have been introduced into different societies by, this is Madison, some individual whose singular endowments and supernatural pretensions had given him an ascendancy for the purpose. All these great reformers in ancient times were regarded as more than men and ultimately worshipped as gods. Perhaps there is a role for angels in this after all. Once knowledge of agriculture was established, in spite of human disinclination to regimented work, social dynamics made turning back too painful for too many. With agriculture securely in place, he writes, the mouths fed by it increasing and the surplus of nature decreasing, necessity becomes a spur to industry, which finds another spur in the advantages incident to the acquisition of property in the civilized state. A Malthusian reality, linked with the concept of property, taken directly out of the pages of John Locke, comprised additional spurs to human history. Madison's assumption on a natural human antipathy to labor and preference for indolence, combined with the Malthusian reality, can be seen as well in some of his private letters and his vehement critiques of the socialist Robert Owen and the utopian anarchist William Godwin. Writing to Nicholas Trist about Owen's experimental community at New Harmony, Indiana, Madison begins his assault discussing how the problems then plaguing Owen's Great Britain should have instructed Owen that such diseases are, however, too deeply rooted in human society to admit of more than great palliatives. After explaining the reasons why every populous country is liable to contingencies that must distress a portion of its inhabitants, Madison criticizes Owen directly. He writes, Mr. Owen's remedy for these vicissitudes implies that labor will be relished without the ordinary impulses to it, that the love of equality will supersede the desire for distinction, and that the increasing leisure from the improvements of machinery will promote intellectual cultivation, moral enjoyment, and innocent amusements without any of the vicious resorts for the ennui of idleness. Clearly, Madison doesn't think most humans can enjoy labor. And even if they are inclined to desire leisure, the ennui of idleness presented social problems to be avoided. Indeed, Madison had previously shown his concern for the social consequences of the necessity of labor and the love of idleness when he offered the following comment to Thomas Hurdle in 1809 on Hurdle's laudable but ultimately doomed project of abolishing altogether the use of intoxicating and even exhilarating drinks. Now, Madison was a teetotaler, all right? So here's what he writes. He says, a complete suppression of every species of stimulating indulgence, if attainable at all, must be the work of peculiar difficulty, since it has to encounter not only the force of habit, but propensities in human nature. In every age and nation, some exhilarating or exciting substance seems to have been sought for as relief from the languor of idleness and the fatigues of labor. In the rudest state of society, whether in hot or cold climates, a passion for ardent spirits is in a manner universal. And where all these sources of excitement have been unknown or been totally prohibited by a religious faith, substitutes have been found in opium, in the nut of the betel, the root of the ginseng, or the leaf of the tobacco plant. Madison's criticisms of Godwin are even more strident than those of Owen. This might be due to the simple fact that Godwin's 1820 publication titled On Population, an inquiry concerning the power of increase in the numbers of mankind, being an answer to Mr. Malthus's essay on the subject. Could you Twitter that? That title alone? I mean, I just imagine an editor just going ballistic if you tried today to put that as the title of your book. Anyway, so he writes to Edward Everett, the theory of Mr. Godwin, if it deserves the name, is answered by the barefaced errors both of fact and of inference which meet the eye on every page. 2 years earlier, in a letter to Richard Rush, Madison compiled a detailed list of errors the dogmatic Godwin committed. While Madison suspected that, quote, in this country, the fallacies of the author will be smiled at, he concludes his letter telling Rush, if the heretical work should attract conversations in which you may be involved, some of the facts, which you are saved the trouble of hunting up, thanks to Madison's letter, may rebut misstatements from misinformed friends or illiberal opponents of our country. Okay, still, it's surplus population that always seemed to concern Madison and to which he returned. He acknowledged the known tendency in all organized beings to multiply beyond the degree necessary to keep up their actual numbers. He also recognized the wisdom of nature in providing automatic checks against this. He writes, nature has been equally provident in guarding against an excessive multiplication of any one species which might too far encroach on others, by subjecting each, when duly multiplying itself, to be arrested in its progress by the effect of the multiplication. One, in producing a deficiency of food, and where that may not happen, in producing a state of the atmosphere unfavorable to life and health. In light of Madison's own tendencies towards hypochondria, his claim about overcrowding is understandable. Robert Rutland, an editor of the Madison papers, claimed that Madison had the best stocked medicine chest in all of America. Anyway, Madison argued that all animals as well as plants sicken and die in a state too much crowded. More to the point, he wrote that to the same laws mankind are equally subject. Madison presented historic evidence to support this position. It was the vitiated air alone, he claimed, which put out human life in the crowded hole of Calcutta. Nor was Calcutta an isolated incident. The effects of overcrowding are universal. In all confined situations, from the dungeon to the crowded workhouse, and from these to the compact population of overgrown cities, the atmosphere becomes, in corresponding degrees, unfitted by reiterated use for sustaining human life and health. Nature, therefore, was not only the need for balance and moderation, it also contains limits beyond which it cannot sustain human life. He writes, and were the whole habitable earth covered with a dense population, wasteful maladies might be looked for that would thin the numbers into a healthy proportion. Now, prior to making his specific suggestions to improve agriculture in Virginia, and I won't bore you with those, Madison discussed one additional factor that benefited humanity in its attempts at development: the invention of political and social institutions that allow for the free flowing of human potential. Although the richness of the Virginia environment certainly helped provide for its progressive state of development, Madison also attributed a measure of credit to that of the fertile activity of a free people and the benign influence of a responsible government. Now I'm going to look at some of his more politically motivated. Having operated under the mainly ad hoc rules of the Articles of Confederation for almost a decade, the country, 1787, had reached a point where few of the political elite were satisfied with its ability to control state governments, and many committed patriots began to despair of the possibility of having an enduring republic in America. This concern became crystallized when news of a taxpayers' revolt in Massachusetts spread throughout eastern United States. The influence of the Massachusetts taxpayers' revolt, which historians have dubbed Shays' Rebellion, cannot scarcely be overrated. What Daniel Shays and some Massachusetts debtors actually did remains unimportant. What matters is what George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and others believed were the intentions of the rebels. For this information, they relied on Henry Knox's imaginative report. Acting as superintendent of war under the Articles of Confederation, Knox constructed a fabricated but frightening account of the rebellion. He claimed that between 12 and 15,000 men were part of Shays' force, and that they endorsed the following radical leveling position. Position was, since the property of the United States had been protected from British confiscation by the joint exertions of all Americans, it therefore ought to be the common property of all Americans. To achieve those ends, therefore, Knox believed the rebels hoped to capture Boston, loot the Bank of Massachusetts, gain additional supporters, and march southward, redistributing property along the way. In fact, Shays' force of approximately 1,200 men was soundly defeated by early 1787. Nevertheless, the impact of Shays' uprising and its enormous contribution to the constitutional cause was recalled by Madison himself over a quarter of a century after the fact. In 1821, Madison observed, he's talking about the past, the recent and alarming insurrection headed by Shays in Massachusetts produced a very sensible effect on the public mind. Thus, the Constitutional Convention of 1787 provided an opportunity to reconstruct a new government along more viable lines, and Madison made sure that the opportunity did not pass. Depending on how one counts, there are 20 separate components to Madison's grand design. Some were not discussed in the Federalists, others were rejected at Philadelphia, several were developed after the Constitution had been functioning. In letters to Jefferson, Washington, and Randolph, Madison sketched out his preliminary thoughts on the essential features needed for a new centralized government. First, an extended commercial republic at the base. Second, a sufficiently neutral, dispassionate, disinterested government. 3, an appropriate scheme of representation. 4, popular ratification of the Constitution to ensure its national supremacy. 5, regulation of trade and other issues requiring uniform policy. 6, a national executive. 7, the express power of the national government to coerce state governments. 8, greater separation of powers between the branches. 9, enlargement of both the power and number of representatives. 10, national supremacy of the judiciary. 11, a national guarantee of state tranquility. These, in some form or other, were all adopted at the convention. 3 of his favorite ideas were not. First, a council of revision to check the efforts of the legislature. Second, representation in both houses of Congress based on population. Third, a national absolute veto in all cases whatsoever of state laws. Madison did not seem very bothered by the rejection of his ideas of a council of revision. That he thought proportionate representation in both houses of Congress would be readily agreed upon by the small states is one of the rare moments in Madison's life when he allowed his imagination to blind him to political reality. But when the convention refused to adopt the national veto of state laws, Madison thought, at least momentarily, that the Constitution was doomed to failure, since it would not be strong enough to curb the democratic tendencies in the states. Sometime after the Philadelphia Convention, he added 5 additional points. 1, there was no need for a separate Bill of Rights because the Constitution itself was a Bill of Rights. However, once he pragmatically agreed to adopting a Bill of Rights, he wanted it applied to both the national and the state governments. Second, he has a theory of constitutional interpretation based on the states and what the delegates at the state ratifying conventions thought the Constitution meant, not the actions of those in Philadelphia. Third, he has a view of changing the Constitution that had nothing to do with the formal amendment process. 4, talks about the need to extend suffrage as slowly as possible. And 5, the need for public education to create enlightened citizens. Now, to discuss even briefly each of these points is far beyond the time limits of this morning and your patience. So I will talk about 3 of his most essential ideas from before the convention and 3 from after the convention to further show the outlines of his overarching theory. Madison's theory of the virtue of an extended commercial republic. Anyone who's taken even an introductory level course in American politics is probably familiar with this argument. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, Madison thought the fundamental problem in government was how to control factions. It's helpful also to remember his statement about every Athenian assembly turning into a mob. And since men were neither angels nor philosopher, it would be wonderful if you could find a way to get them to control themselves. In Federalist 10, he writes, "Extend the sphere and you take in greater variety of parties and interest. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other." Rather than attempt to prevent the formation of these self-interested factional groups, governments must tolerate them, for the effect of many interests would be to ensure that no one group could gain sufficient power to become tyrannical. Society itself will be broken into so many parts that the rights of the individuals will be in little danger from interested combinations of the majority, Madison observes. The existence of a multiplicity of factions would have the effect of achieving a balance or equilibrium, thereby mitigating against the possibility of a majority faction. Of course, it remains crucial to remember that Madison's real fear is not some abstract, unspecified majority faction, but in Martin Diamond's words, the majority faction. That is, the great mass of the little propertied and the unpropertied. Madison conceived of the politics of space, that a large area to govern is itself a partial cure to the diseases of factions. The beauty of it was that it did not rely on virtue or goodwill. It was simply in the nature of a plural society that groups, spread out over a large geographic area, will balance each other and help the system run like a machine. All right. Second, if a commercial republic was the base of Madison's politics, he also saw the virtue of a specific design to the government, where each of the branches would check each other, and the most dangerous branch, the legislative, would itself be divided, where federalism would create 2 separate and at times conjoined structures of government that would check each other as well. Here, the simple act of dividing power, again, not relying on goodwill or positive motives, could help ensure stability. As he put it, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. He closes the 10th Federalist with the famous words, "In the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government." Third, his scheme of representation. It should be noted that Madison carefully distinguished between the term democratic and republican, specifically calling his proposed regime a republic. To his mind, a republic differed from democratic forms not only in that it preserved liberty, but was also larger both physically and numerically, and that it included a scheme of representation. This last distinction has largely been lost in modern times, where we tend to think of all democracies as possessing some scheme of representation. The term representative government is very close to the Madisonian republic. Whether or not it's appropriate to call Madison's system democratic is an important question that we will confront shortly. For the present, let us examine further Madisonian notion of republican government. In Federalist 39, Madison defines a republic to be a government which derives all of its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people. A few things should be said about this definition. First, although power must ultimately come from the people, it may be authorized by indirect methods. Madison tried to keep the relationship between the people and the government as indirect as politically possible. Indeed, in his concluding contribution to the Federalists, Madison boasted that the true distinction between the ancient republics and his proposed experiment lies in the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity. We, the people, never act collectively. We all vote on the same day during national elections, but we vote as members of particular states, not a nation. Second, just who comprises the category of the people is not readily apparent. What at first to be a rather open and popular basis of government eventually turns out to be somewhat restrictive. Perhaps more important, it's also evident that Madison tried to keep suffrage, at this point in his life, as limited as political reality would permit. In a similar manner, Madison's system of representation was designed to serve functions other than the mere reflection of popular opinion. He viewed it as an additional curb on potentially tyrannical factions. Recall, Madison did not have a very flattering view of humanity. In a private letter at this time, he noted, this is Madison, "Whatever respect may be due to the rights of private judgment, and no man feels more of it than I do, there can be no doubt that there are subjects to which the capacities of the bulk of mankind are unequal, and on which they must and will be governed by those with whom they happen to have acquaintance and confidence." In Madison's scheme, the representative is perceived as playing the role of statesman or trustee, providing a check against majority tyranny. Madison is rather explicit about the matter. He writes, "The effect of the first difference representation is on the one hand to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdoms may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to a temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves." Let me jump to the Bill of Rights, keeping my eye on the clock. The Bill of Rights. As is well known, the Constitution of 1787 did not contain an explicit Bill of Rights. When Thomas Jefferson first read the document while he was in Paris, his reaction to this was unequivocal and negative. Jefferson writes, "But I own it astonishes me to find such a change wrought in the opinions of our countrymen since I left them, as that 3/4 of them should be content to live under a system which leaves to the governors the power of taking from them the trial by jury in civil cases, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of commerce, the habeas corpus laws, and the yoking them with a standing army. This is a degeneracy in the principles of liberty to which I had given 4 centuries instead of 4 years." The desirability of a Bill of Rights was an issue upon which Madison and Jefferson disagreed, although Madison eventually relented. When he saw that the Constitution might not be ratified, he shifted ground and became champion of the Bill of Rights. Still, Madison's argument, and for the moment it was a good one, is that the Constitution itself was a Bill of Rights, since it granted to the government enumerated powers only. If the Constitution was silent on any issue, the government could not act because it had not been granted the power to do so. This position can be seen in the speech he made at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. says, can the general government exercise any power not delegated? If an enumeration made of our rights, will it not be implied that everything omitted is given to the general government? Has not the honorable gentleman himself admitted that an imperfect enumeration is dangerous? These are all questions if you can't get the inflection. Does the Constitution say that they shall not alter the laws of descent, or do these things which would subvert the whole system of the state? If it did, what was not accepted would be granted. Does it follow from the omission of such restrictions that they can exercise powers not delegated? The reverse of the proposition holds. The delegation alone warrants the exercise of power. Of course, Alexander Hamilton and John Marshall would destroy this perspective, but that's another story. Now extending suffrage. At the Constitutional Convention, Madison argued for a property qualification for electors to the House of Representatives. The freeholders would be the safest depositories of Republican liberty. When the issue of voting in the Senate arose, he again advocated that landholders ought to have a share in the government to support their invaluable interests. The voting pattern must be drawn up, he stated, to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Okay? So that's his position at the Constitutional Convention. I think it's more important to see what he has to say later in life. It says, in 1821, while correcting and expanding his own convention notes from other recently printed accounts of the Constitutional Convention, Madison recorded a modest but highly significant change in his views on suffrage. This is, I don't know if he even comments on anything else in his entire notes but suffrage. He says, okay, this is a note to convention speech of August 7th. It says, these observations of 1787 do not convey the speaker's more full and mature view of the subject, which is subjoined. He felt too much at the time the example of Virginia. Now, more than 3 decades after arguing his freeholders' position, Madden explicitly rejected any voting conditions that would, either then or in the future, exclude the mass of society from some degree of political participation. As before, Madison still relied on the stabilizing advantages provided by the availability of large amounts of free land spread over an extended commercial republic. But Madison's Malthusian worldview was creeping further into his thinking about the future. Madison's notes say, the U states have a precious advantage also in the actual distribution of property, particularly the landed property, and in the universal hope of acquiring it. This latter peculiarity is among the happiest contrasts in their situation to that of the Old World, where no anticipated change in this respect can generally inspire a like sympathy with the rights of property. There may be at present a majority of the nation who are even freeholders, or the heirs or aspirants to freeholds, and the day may not be very near when such will cease to make up a majority of the community, but they cannot always so continue. It's precisely this future, when the propertyless mass comprise the majority, which Madison dreads most. In 1821, Madison's vision still contains at least the vision of most individuals, the hope that most individuals could acquire property. In less than a decade, however, this hope disappears from his considerations. In 1829, Madison entered the public arena in Richmond, Virginia for his final effort in constitution making. He decided that the suffrage question was of such fundamental import that it was the issue upon which he would address the assembly and submit a memorandum, thereby ensuring his thoughts, ensuring his thoughts were recorded for history. As usual, Madison avoided a purely theoretical approach and grounded his proposal in the context of Virginia politics and history. His written memorandum dealt with his great fear when it came to suffrage, the inevitable creation of a growing class that survives on subsistence wages. Echoing Malthus, anticipating Marx, and supporting Martin Diamond, Madison observes, I'm sure they won't argue about that. It is a law of nature, now well understood, that the earth, under a civilized cultivation, is capable of yielding subsistence for a large surplus of consumers, beyond those having an immediate interest in the soil, a surplus which must increase with the increasing improvements in agriculture and the labor-saving arts supplied to it. And it is the lot of humanity that this surplus, it is the lot of humanity that of this surplus a large proportion is necessarily reduced by a competition for employment to wages which afford them the bare necessaries of life. Madison then repeated his lifelong perspective on the central problem. But given the laws of political economy, and even hope would be removed from the future of the propertyless, he writes, that proportion being without property, or the hope of acquiring it, cannot be expected to sympathize with its rights, to be safe depositors of power over them. Madison asks apprehensively, what is to be done with this unfavored class? Reluctantly, he now extends suffrage to, quote, every description of citizens having a sufficient stake in the public order, and particularly the housekeepers and heads of families. Nevertheless, he stubbornly refused to embrace universal suffrage. In classic Madison style, he rejects theory for prudence. His final words on suffrage are these: it would be happy if, as in if men were angels, if a state of society could be found or framed in which an equal voice in making the laws might be allowed every individual bound to obey them. But this is a theory which, like most theories, confessedly requires limitations and modifications. And the only question to be decided in this, as in other cases, turns out on the particular degree of departure in practice required by the essence and object of the theory itself. Hardly a ringing exultation in support of democratic principle, the preceding passage does nevertheless show that Madison recognized the necessity of the republic eventually becoming democratic. In fact, he sounds remarkably like James Mill, not John Stuart, James Mill, on why suffrage had to be extended. But to make the republic safe, Madison had to try to liberalize the democracy. And here is where public education comes in, and I'll be finished in a minute. Madison, along with his ally and friend Jefferson, saw the need for public education, especially as the vote was being given to larger segments of the society. We can see the logic of the case being spelled out in an 1822 letter where Madison noted that, quote, the liberal appropriations made by the legislature of Kentucky for a general system of education cannot be too much applauded. Madison concluded this letter, and I the talk, with the following eloquent words. And it's interesting to note that these words are etched on the exterior of the Madison wing of the Library of Congress. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and the people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. Thank you.
One of the final points you made about how people who vote should have property. Jefferson also agreed with that, but then also early on in his political career, then suggested for a redistribution of property in at least the state of Virginia, so that all white men would have at least 50 acres that they would have, so that they could vote. So there was a property qualification that he put in, but then he sort of ultimately undid it by saying that every sort of white individual in the state of Virginia would have that. Did Madison have any similar sort of redistribution policies?
Not that I'm aware of, but both Madison and Jefferson did think Louisiana was going to buy America so many years because for all intents and purposes, it was the equivalent of free land. I mean, they both saw land as being absolutely crucial to economic freedom, which was crucial to political freedom. But for Madison, property is an absolute and natural right. And even though a lot of historians in particular want to fight about this, all the textual evidence is Jefferson did not think of property as a natural right. Okay? It's a civil right, it's an instrumental right. The natural rights are the life, liberty, and the pursuit thereof.
Dr. Allen.
Hello, Bill. It's been about 20 years since I've seen you.
It's been 20 years.
Be gentle.
Good to see you again.
Yes.
Let's revisit the suffrage question. And you said, as I heard you, two things about it. One, that Madison was reluctant to extend it. But two, Madison conceded that it had to be extended. So the real question is, who is the true Madison? So what I'd like to do is pull this out a bit further, if you don't mind. And starting with that 1829 convention contribution that he made, and which you cited. He does specifically point out that the issue is whether to acknowledge rights of property or rights of persons. he certainly argues that both are legitimate to be acknowledged. But if I remember correctly, he accepts the theoretical requirement that at the end of the day, if you can't have both, the rights of persons trump the rights of property. If I remember that correctly from that particular contribution. So the question would become, if he acknowledges this, and therefore ultimate democracy, whether his prudence is in any way undermining his understanding, or whether his prudence only addresses what we might call the political necessity of the circumstances. And let me put that in the context of the observation that the previous question suggests regarding his party press essays earlier, when he describes Virginia, of all places, as an aristocracy, on the basis of including the population of the slaves in the count of the total population, by which he quite implicitly, perhaps one would say explicitly, acknowledges that if it was going to be a true republic, it would have to emancipate. And as long as it did not emancipate, it could only be an aristocracy. So taking those two ends of the spectrum together, would you not agree with me that Madison is unambiguously committed to full suffrage, only prudently acknowledging the difficulty of accomplishing it?
Gee, if I simply said yes, would that be the end? Well, I can't do that. She's paying me not to say yes. All right, this is really complicated and terrific, actually. I wish I had brought, and I did bring one Madison reader, but I don't think they have what he said at the convention in 829 and what he
Myers
wrote.
might.
But first, you're absolutely right. He's reluctant. He says government has to protect both the rights of persons and the rights of property. And what his solution is, and some people are fine with this, it just grates on my nerves. If I remember right, he wants to have two houses. Well, he's always going to believe in that. In one house, it's full suffrage. Everyone participates. But the other house, he's going to restrict suffrage to. Now, he thinks that's fair. All right, only the property holders, there's a certain property qualification, can vote. I'm going, that gives them more power. Okay, and hence it's not fair. On the other hand, and this is part of what confuses me about American scholars writing on Madison, this still puts him ahead of what's happening in England. I mean, you know, there we have John Stuart Mill, by all accounts, the liberals' liberal. And he's spending time trying to figure out a weighted voting scheme, where intellectuals' votes count something like 12 times more than the working classes vote. So, you know, I don't understand why we appear to be obsessed with making Madison more than he is. Okay? At the end of the day, he still wants that two-house scheme, and I think he's old and he realizes something's going to have to happen to address those who don't even meet that minimum standard. But he's worried that if there is no hope of acquiring property, why would these people care about voting for it? Okay? And actually, Marx will say the same thing. I don't know, Alan's a better scholar on this, does Diamond ever cite Madison's last speeches as evidence that it's the property list?
No.
All right, but you know, when I read that, I thought, well, Diamond was coming under a lot of attack at the time. I thought this certainly lends support to what Diamond is saying.
Can I just ask you to find and really try to press Bill's point even more? I mean, what Bill's saying, I think, is at the end of the day, if property is endangered by this propertyless poor, nevertheless, they still get the right to vote, right? No matter what, the majority still rules. The propertyless still get the right to vote in Madison's scheme.
No, he's not going to allow them to. He won't extend it. He says about if.
I think that's factually wrong. I just think that's factually wrong.
Read the text. He says if you can do that, that's great.
Many times. I mean,
he uses if the same way. It's like if men were angels. Subtext, we know they're not. If it were possible. Subtext, we know it's not. He's going to extend it as far as he possibly can. I think he goes to bed that night thinking, someday they're going to have to do it, but he's not going to be the one.
I'm going to arm myself at lunch, and I know, that's all I can say.
Now, actually, there's one other thing you bring up, or that came to my mind as you brought it up. If you read the speech, it's just incredible, because what I didn't talk about here is he's worried about the race issue, okay? And he specifically brings that up. then he uses a very modern term. He specifically uses the word unconscious. You know, so the first time I saw that, I went, wow, when does that become part of the vocabulary? And he uses it in the sophisticated sense. Now, I'm well aware Freud doesn't write, but as Freud points out, he didn't discover the unconscious. The Greeks knew about that a long time ago. So Madison is also worried about, my God, if you give these people without any property the vote, forget about slavery. Okay, they're just going to overturn all of the laws inside of Virginia, which is not to say Madison was an advocate of slavery, but Madison knew, or in Madison's view, you couldn't simply free, there had to be just compensation. So we're going to continue to disagree on that point. But that last speech of his and the memorandum are simply incredible.